I'm the Dean of the Lerner School of International Affairs Management and Early Policy. Welcome. Thank you. And applause to you all for coming out to hear this incredible panel tonight, entitled Grassroots Politics from Brooklyn to the White House. I had my own little From Brooklyn to the White House adventure 6 years ago when I left Bedford-Stuyvesant to go into the Obama administration, and you always come back. Came back home. So here I am here to welcome you tonight to our incredible event. So just to make sure that you know where you are and who you're with. So the Milano School is really the supposed truth to the interdisciplinary truth of what the new school is actually founded on. It's based on heterodox principles. We are progressive. We put on panels like this. We have centers like the New York City Center of Affairs. We have professors like Jeff Smith, who, if you don't know much about Jeff Smith, you can read his chapters in the Recovering Politicians 12-Step Program to Survive Crisis, which is actually amazing. He's an associate professor here, and we are actually very honored to be able to have him here and to be able to moderate this panel. So we hope that you come and be with us in all of our events. We have a lineup. We're always having events and welcoming the public and our partners and our community in here with us to be able to make sense of what's happening in the politics of the day. Whoever said that politics and policy doesn't mix has never been in policy. So we're here to really dive into that, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Smith, who is our esteemed moderator for this incredible panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dean DePass. I'm actually assistant professor, but I will, first thing I do when I go home is to tell my wife about my new promotion to associate. Thank you. So, and thank you to Andrew White, who's the director of the Center for New York City Affairs, which is hosting this panel, and to all of his staff that helped arrange the logistics. 10 years ago, this month, wearing an ill-fitting suit and having forgotten in a rush to wear a belt, I traveled from St. Louis to Washington, D.C. for the second time in my life. I was a candidate in a 10-way Missouri congressional primary, and the front runner was a guy named Russ Carnahan. His grandfather had been a congressman and a U.S. ambassador. His father was a successful two-term governor. His mother was a U.S. senator. His sister was Secretary of State. My dad was a golf coach, and my mom taught children who had learning disabilities. He raised over $1 million. He had all the endorsements. He was 40 points ahead of the field in all the polls. I was in Washington to meet a guy named Stu Rothenberg. Rothenberg was considered the dean of Washington political prognosticators, his word taken as gospel by many of the interest group leaders and lobbyists who steered money en masse towards the candidates that he pronounced as likely winners. "All right, give me your spiel," he said warily. I told him that I'd recruited over 600 volunteers, many of whom were my former students, and that they distributed nearly 5,000 yard signs across the district. And by the time we got to election day, I vowed, we would have 100 coffees in people's homes. We'd already had over 50. He laughed at me. "You know how many candidates like you come in here every election cycle and tell me about their big grassroots campaigns?" he said. "And do you know how many of them are sitting in Congress right now? 0. Quietly fuming, I thanked him for his time and left without reminding him of Paul Wellstone and the many other grassroots candidates who had won and made it to Congress or even the Senate. I was determined to prove him wrong. But in the end, I failed to do so. Although we were ahead the entire night on election night, at about 4 in the morning, new votes were found in the ward of my opponent, and I ended up losing by about 1 percentage point. You might think that Rothenberg, who eventually admitted that he was very surprised by our campaign, is just one cynical, grizzled Washington insider who had seen too many campaigns. But his opinion about the efficacy of grassroots politics is widely shared, and unfortunately nowhere more so than in the academy. Most political scientists have long argued that grassroots campaigns don't matter. Indeed, many have even argued that campaigns in general have little to no impact on the outcome of elections. How can this be? How can it be that people like Mitch Stewart and Michael Blake and Susan Lerner and Zakiyah Ansari here with us tonight, and I, have seen the tremendous power of grassroots organizing to inspire people, to turn them into activists, converting others behind a cause or a candidate? And yet, erudite observers like Stu Rothenberg and so many others poo-poo this and suggest that money, not motivation or mobilization, is all that really counts in campaigns. Well, I'd argue that this is because of something called the drunkard search. Have you ever seen a drunk stumble out of a bar looking for his keys? Well, where does he go to look? He goes under the streetlight. For most political scientists who look for campaign effects, they are trying to publish in quantitatively oriented academic journals. And for them, that streetlight that they're looking under to see if campaigns do make a difference is the large data sets of general election data compiled by institutional sources. Because of incentives related to academic publishing, then, academics are mostly looking for campaign effects in exactly the wrong place. They're looking at general elections when grassroots organizing has a much bigger impact in primary elections. They're looking at candidate races when grassroots organizing often has more of an impact in issue campaigns and initiative campaigns as opposed to candidate races. Although a few academics have more recently begun to do experimental work to gauge the true impact of grassroots campaigns in other settings, most scholars continue to dismiss it. None of the four people that are joining us tonight would ever dismiss the power of grassroots organizing because they've seen it. And in many cases, they've orchestrated it. They've helped lead critical initiatives to reform the redistricting process and to reform our campaign finance system. They've helped form national grassroots movements around neighborhood-based education in communities of color. And there's one other thing they've done, which I think is fairly notable. They elected a president. So we are really lucky to have four amazing grassroots organizers with us tonight. First, we'll be joined by Mitch Stewart. Mitch Stewart is a founding partner at 270 Strategies. Currently, he's spearheading Ready for Hillary, the unofficial Clinton shadow campaign. As the battleground states director for the Obama for America campaign, he oversaw a state strategy and program that garnered victories in 9 of the 10 battleground states in the 2012 presidential election, and even more importantly, made Karl Rove look like a total moron on live television. He helped build what The Guardian called a historic ground operation that will provide the model for political campaigns in America and around the world for decades to come. In the 2008 campaign, where it all got started, Mitch served as the state director in Iowa. I know, I went up and volunteered 6 or 7 times and watched the operation grow from a little tiny operation outside the storefront to a massive operation with thousands and thousands of volunteers from all over the country. As Virginia State Director in the fall campaign in 2008, Mitch led the team that delivered Virginia for the Democratic candidate for the first time since 1964, breaking a Republican streak of 44 years and laying the foundation for continued Democratic success in 2012 and 2013 in Virginia. We are very blessed tonight to be joined by Mitch Stewart.
Thank you, everyone. It's a very warm welcome, Jeff. I don't get that often, especially working in politics. I thought maybe what would be most illustrative is telling you a little bit about how I got involved in this. And I think everyone here has a story about what motivated them, or potentially what motivated them to take action. In fact, it's one of the most powerful tools an organizer has. Just talking a little bit about the story of why they are engaged. And so here's mine. I'm from South Dakota originally. Can anyone pick up the accent? It's charming. This way, it's charming. Has anyone here been from South Dakota? Or traveled to? Okay. All right, handful. And so I got involved in politics not because of a drive as a young person or even in college. Senator Tim Johnson, his youngest son, and I were best friends growing up. And so when I graduated with a degree in biology and a minor in chemistry, with virtually no political experience other than my sister worked for Senator Tom Daschle for a little bit, I got a job in his official office because I thought it would be a really strong resume builder. And I worked for a year and a half with him. Shortly after 9/11 and the anthrax attack that happened in Washington, D.C., decided to move back to South Dakota and thought that maybe getting home would do me some good. And we were gearing up at that point in 2002 for what was claimed and what proved to be true was the biggest Senate race in the country. In 2002, which was a historically bad year for Democrats, specifically Democrats running in the Senate, John Thune was going to run against Tim Johnson. Tim's sort of an unassuming South Dakotan. Every direct mail picture we had him wearing a flannel shirt. And so we were running up against a rock star, and in a state that George W. Bush had carried 2 years prior by 21 or 22 percentage points. Long story short, we worked very hard in South Dakota in 2002, and specifically, we really worked to engage and spread civic participation on the Indian reservations in South Dakota. In fact, South Dakota has 3 of the 10 poorest counties in the country, and they are all on Indian reservations. Pine Ridge, some of you may have heard of Wounded Knee. There's a host of discrimination that's happened in South Dakota, specifically with Native Americans. And Native Americans overwhelmingly supported Tim and Democrats. And so we said a key to success here is making sure that we engage that community, register as many Native Americans as possible, and then make sure that we turn out and vote. I was in South Dakota for about 10 months, and George W. Bush came to South Dakota 5 times. And so in a race that everyone expected us to lose, that was seen as a proxy to the 2004 presidential campaign between Tom Daschle and George W. Bush, election night took forever. Polls closed, I think, at 7. And we also had mountain time, so we had to wait another hour, and then polls actually closed. And we started off way behind. And slowly throughout the night, we were starting to catch up. And it wasn't until 7 the next morning that Tim Johnson pulled ahead. And it was Shannon County, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, that put Tim over the top. He ended up winning by 524 votes, the closest election in the country. The joke is that was 10 percentage points in South Dakota. But it was very close. And I said to myself, my goodness, I had worked probably 110-hour weeks for almost 8 months, as hard as I've ever worked in my life. And you had the poorest, most disenfranchised community, certainly arguably poorest and most disenfranchised community in our country, stand up and tell the most powerful person in the world, no. I am not going to follow your lead, I'm going to do this. And so for me, that talked about the power of one person standing up in a room standing up in a community, that community standing up in a state and making a difference. That state then making a difference across the country. And so I was hooked. I said, my goodness, if 524 people can tell the President of the United States no, what an awesome power that is. And it became an awesome responsibility. And so I started traveling across the country, working on various political campaigns, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, but always learning. It's an iterative process. Every campaign you run, you get a little smarter. At least you hope you do. 2004 was a heartbreaking race. I still think about it all the time. I worked with Tom Daschle and we lost. And I learned a lot from that campaign, probably more than I wish I had, because you always lose, or you always learn more from losing than you do from winning. But it was in Minnesota in 2006 when then Senator Obama came to the Humphrey Day dinner, which is a very, very sort of ritzy, by Minnesota standards, ritzy fundraiser. And Minnesota, as you can imagine, is predominantly white, and the activists there, just as Jeff was talking about Senator Wellstone, there is a really, really strong and proud lineage of progressive organizers from Minnesota. And so he came in, this is during his Audacity of Hope tour, and he had his initial stump speech. I'm sure you all remember when he's like, nobody pronounced my name, they called me Yo Mama, hey Alabama, and he talked about bringing the country together, And had some friends who said, hey, tell us about the reaction that he gets when he comes. And I was lucky enough to staff him. I was a coordinated campaign director, so I got that duty. I identified myself as being his staffer because I was starstruck, just like a lot of folks were in 2006. And so I walked him through those 3,000 people to get him on stage, and it took about 35 minutes. Signing everything you can imagine. And candidates coming up asking for pictures that they could put on the direct mail pieces, everything that you would imagine. And he was exhausted. He'd been up since 4 that morning. This was the last stop of the day for him. Wanted to get home, fly home, be back in Chicago. And after he gave this raucous speech, one that you've all heard before, I looked at the room, there's 3,000 people there, predominantly white, paid a lot of money to get there, and tears are just streaming down their faces. Not everyone, but a lot. And I was like, wow, I can't believe the movement, that I've seen here today. He comes down off stage, he goes, Mitch, that's my president's trying to imitate it. He looked and said, is this the only way to get through? And he sees 3,000 people lining up asking him to sign everything he did. And I go, I'm trying to stammer up an answer here because I don't want to let him down or disappoint him. And the other thing that Minnesota has, it has a really strong African immigrant community. A gentleman came up who was working security at the hotel. It was a really nice hotel. I think it was a Grand Hyatt or something. It was 40 floors, one of the biggest in Minneapolis. And he said, Senator, sir, I can get you through the kitchen. He looked at me, and I go, oh. He looked out at the crowd again and said, let's go. And so now we're walking through the bowels of this gigantic, fancy, hotel. And it's the people who prepared the food, it's the folks who are washing the dishes, it's the people who delivered the food. And they lined up in this hallway as he's walking through and clapped as he walked out. And so for me, as generally a pretty pragmatic political observer, I said, my goodness, if he can do this in this room full of 3,000 rich white people and see that reaction, but then also come in, the exact same message, exact same, same person, and have folks who generally are left behind or not spoken for in our process, get them motivated to literally line the halls and clap as we walked out. What a unique thing that would be. I'd love to be a part of that. I'd love to help grow and build that. And so, as Jeff talked about, I was lucky, if the Obama world was a Google empire, I'd have a pretty low number, maybe 15 or 16. I was the second person in Iowa. I was a caucus director, as Jeff mentioned, and really got to see this from the inception. And how we organized in Iowa, as we do across the country, really was neighborhood by neighborhood. It was living room by living room. And when he's there, you say, oh gosh, you can get 2,000 or 3,000 people. That's the easy part. What's hard is when he leaves, and you have neighborhood meetings. Or maybe first you start off community-wide or county-wide, and then the more support you get, the more granular you try to get. So then you break it off again. Can we get to neighborhood now? Can we get to precinct now? And you start organizing networks of people who are unified by the same goals, which in Iowa during the caucuses was, we had 1,781 precincts in Iowa, was to make sure that the president won there. And then as you continue through the primary there, through the general election 2008, and the general election 2012, where you had thousands of people organized into teams. We call it snowflake, which at some point maybe we can get into, where people telling their story, just like I told you, and feeling empowered to make positive change in this world. Laying out very clear goals, and also providing them the tools and resources so that they can achieve those goals. A campaign ultimately is a list building exercise. We spent $1.1 billion building a list. And there's 3 ways you can grow your list. You can do it by registering new supporters, you can do it by persuading undecided voters, and you can do it by getting out the vote or maximizing your list of people. The fourth part of that then is building an organization to deliver those 3 programs I just laid out. So think about it. Every piece of mail that we sent, every TV ad, every digital ad that we did, was either built towards registering new supporters, persuading undecided, maximizing our list of supporters by getting them out to vote, or by recruiting new volunteers. That's all we did. It's not rocket science, although as Jeff talked about, it's becoming more and more like rocket science with the optimization that's happening. But ultimately, that's what a campaign is. And so, and then I'll just say two other things, and then I'll jump off the microphone here. A couple of the iterations or the big steps forward that happened in 2012, even more so than what we did in 2008, are twofold. So the first is data and analytics. And a lot of people say, well, my goodness, how can you have this, this organization that's built on people telling their personal stories and getting bought in and, building relationships with people? How can it be driven then by very hard, cold, calculated numbers? And frankly, what we did is we used analytics to measure what's the best way for us to build a relationship. There's a reason why I told you my story, because it works. And so we measured that. And we were very intentional about measuring how we can build a relationship so that ultimately you can join our organization and you can help us register unregistered supporters, persuade undecided, and turn out our voters. So, data and analytics. And then we measured something called the EIP, the Experiment Informed Program. We measured everything we did so that we could optimize our three programs I just laid out. So what's the most effective way we can register an unregistered supporter? What's the most effective or what's the most efficient way that we can persuade an undecided supporter? Or what's the most efficient way that we can get someone to vote who might not likely vote if you don't touch or talk to them? There's a whole new field of politics now that's based solely on that. We had 55 people, and Mike will be talking in a little bit and attest to this, probably the smartest people I've ever met, all with advanced degrees in math or economists, statisticians, and they looked at everything we did and then provided us guidance. And you'd be looking at a 2% efficiency gain or 3% efficiency gain or maybe a 4% efficiency gain, which doesn't sound like a lot, but we had 150 million attempts. Volunteers generated 150 million door knocks and phone calls. They contacted roughly 20% of them. 25%. So you're looking at, roughly 30 to 35 to 40 million conversations. So if you talk about a 4% efficiency of 40 million, that's 1.6 million more votes. That's the math that we did in our head. And we broke it down to state, and then to county, and then finally to neighborhood. So every one of those volunteer teams I just talked about knew how many people they had to register, knew how many people they had to persuade, and knew how many people they had to turn out. So that's the melding of the relational-based organizing that a lot of us are familiar with, and the data and analytics. And what we really found is when we told our teams that, said if you do this work, and that there's 10,000 other neighborhood teams across the country doing the same thing, it was incredibly empowering. People marched in sync, not because they were worried about a top-down retribution, but because they were bought into the goals. And so, I look forward to having a conversation with you all, answering some questions. But the power of grassroots organizing ultimately comes down to one person taking initiative. And it started for me in 2002 in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, where one person stood up, changed the mood of a room. I'm sure you heard the president say this, that room that changed the mood of a city. And in 2002, what got me hooked to this is that literally the poorest people in our country stood up and told the most powerful person in the world no. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mitch. That was fantastic. Now I'd like to introduce our other panelists this evening. Zakiyah Ansari is Advocacy Director for the New York State Alliance for Quality Education, a coalition promoting educational equity across New York State. She's also co-initiator of a recently formed national grassroots movement called Journey for Justice, an alliance of community-based organizations in 18 cities across the United States, representing youth, parents, and intergenerational organizations who are all organizing around community-based education. She also happens to be my former student, so I'm very proud to have her. Michael Blake is founding principal of Capital Strategy Group. which focuses on political and economic empowerment for communities of color. He is Director of Public Policy and External Affairs for Green for All, a national organization working to build an inclusive green economy strong enough to lift people out of poverty. Blake previously served as Senior Advisor to the Office of Public Engagement for President Obama's 2013 Presidential Inaugural Committee and as the National Deputy Director of Operation Vote for President Obama's 2012 re-election. Michael? And Susan Lerner is Executive Director of Common Cause New York. She speaks and writes extensively on redistricting, ethics, and campaign finance reform. She is a founding member of a new coalition, New York Women Vote, to educate and mobilize women to participate in the democratic process. She founded and chaired the Committee for Judicial Independence, a grassroots organization dedicated to educating and activating Americans to the importance of an independent federal judiciary, and also led a statewide coalition of groups active on federal judicial nomination. For almost 20 years before that, she was a trial lawyer in Los Angeles, specializing in complex commercial litigation and intellectual property. Susan, thanks for being here. Well, I'd like to just start out by asking each one of you, and Mitch is already gone, to tell your story in your own words. Maybe taking a couple minutes to do that. Susan, do you want to start?
Well, who decided I would go after Mitch? Gee, you walk off the train from Albany and you find yourself listening to the empowerment story of our past decade. But I've been an organizer for pretty much my entire adult life, and one thing struck me in terms of what Mitch was saying, which was that he spent the most intensive 10 months of his life on the reservation, moving, identifying individual voters, moving them to the polls. For those of us who work on issue advocacy, not on candidate campaigns, that's a sprint. We work on our issues sometimes for, frankly, decades, building, and again, but the same building blocks. There are the one-to-one, person-to-person touch, and there is absolutely no substitute for that, activating individuals with whatever tools we have. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that the campaign finance movement, which is where I'm spending most of my time these days, just doesn't have 1.1 billion at its command. But we can do the same things with tools that are perhaps less mechanized, less technological. We can track people, we can build the relationships, and that's what we do. Person by person, forum by forum. And when we're doing issue advocacy, as we have to here in New York, because I spent a substantial part of my adult life in California, and while I was a trial lawyer, I was also doing organizing on the side for my sanity. And there, it was much closer to the situation with the candidate campaign because we had initiatives. If we couldn't get something through the legislature, we always could circulate petitions and get our issue on the ballot. We always had that threat, and that threat helped move our legislators in California. That's not the case here in New York. In New York, too much, I believe, of our effort and our grassroots efforts are spent focused on Albany, and not enough spent building the relationships in the districts. Because at the end of the day, what is going to move our legislators is what they're hearing back home. Not what advocates are saying, not what busloads of people from around the state are saying. And we are moving busloads of people around the state next week. And any of you who are interested in joining us, we would love to have you on the Fair Elections Public Financing of Elections campaign. So we'll have busloads of people, and I was just up in Albany, and there were busloads of people, large groups of people moving through the halls. And yes, that will help us with our issues, and yes, it is an essential part of what we do. But more essential is the hard work in each and every district. talking to individuals, being persuasive, doing the educational forums that a Common Cause, that a League of Women Voters do, talking about these issues that aren't so sexy. What is redistricting anyway? And why would anybody care about it? We all know about the problem of money in politics, but how do you get somebody to believe that there is a solution and that there is a better way to do it? Because they'll tell you money is like water and it moves always, no matter what you do. So you have to marshal your facts, and you have to be willing to talk to individual people, and you have to give them faith that we can improve our system, and that the dream of democracy is an obtainable dream, that we can continue to perfect our system of governance, our system of elections, and that we can make it better and live closer to our ideals. And the most satisfying thing that I do, actually, is to go out and talk to small groups. The Rotary Club of Syosset, whom I had lunch with yesterday, and to make that connection, and to see people who believe that these important policy issues that those of us who work on good government issues and on reform struggle with every single day, that those policy issues are more than just politics. And to see that connection on the part of a person who is engaged in their community in a local way, and to realize that there's an issue that they can get involved in a way that they can make a difference. And with those building blocks, that's how we achieve reform.
Thank you. Hearing Susan's exhortation there, and given the composition of the panel, I should tell all of you that at the end of the panel, you'll have a chance to give an email address and instructions on exactly how people can sign up for all of your causes. So, thank you. Michael.
Good to be here. Good evening, everybody. First, as a point of personal privilege, Dean DePass, a great friend who was just phenomenal at EPA to work with her, and I think hopefully you can appreciate the phenomenal leader that you have leading your institution.
And someone, Michael, who was fighting, spent a lot of her career fighting for the very people in Pine Ridge that Mitch just talked about in her role at the EPA.
Absolutely. We can all have Michelle Love Best. We're happy to do that. My name is Mike Blake. I'm born and raised in the Bronx, New York. New York is home for me. And the brief of it is our family's model is that we went from no house to the White House. My full name is Michael Alexander Blake. Michael is for Michael Manley, who was the Prime Minister of Jamaica. Alexander is for Alexander Bustamante, who was the Prime Labor Leader in Jamaica. I was born Christmas Day in '82 with a heart murmur. 18 days I was in the ICU. Family didn't know if I would make it. Came home and grew up in the Bronx. Went to PS 79. Anyone in this room know Jonathan Kozel, educator? The book, Savage Inequalities of Public Education, that was my school. I was at PS 79 when they talked about that. So when someone talks about a kid wondering if you're going to have books, if you're going to have sneakers, you're going to have supplies, that was real. James Carter was my principal. So that was very real and personal for me. So when I left, left here to go to Northwestern, I knew essentially I was going to be one of three things. I was going to be a preacher, I was going to be in politics, I was going to be in journalism. Folks always nod their head about a preacher, I don't know. My mom and I still have conversations about that regularly. And I went to Northwestern, I left school, and I was working for a TV station. I just didn't feel like I was helping people the way I needed to. So I started interning for a state senator named Jeff Schoenberg in 2005. And a woman walked in, and she said, if you don't help me, I'm going to lose my home, which was very real for me because when I was here in New York, we would sell dinners to pay our rent. So when someone walks in and says that, that catches you. It captures your attention very, very quickly. And we helped her keep her home. And I applied for a bunch of jobs. And in 2005, I was offered a job working at Unite here in Chicago, which represents hotel and restaurant employees. And the gentleman, Henry Tamarin, during the final interview said, you know, my son, Nate, is the deputy political director for Senator Obama, and they're starting this program called Yes We Can. You should look at it and find out about it. Didn't know anything about the program. And I turned him down, and 2 days later, his assistant called me up and said, remind me about the program. And I was one of 10 people that went to DC January 06, when then Senator Obama trained us on how to run campaigns. Went to Michigan during the 06 cycle. Dems were down 4 seats. By the end of election night, we were up 4 seats. We took the House back. And in the beginning of 07, figuring out what I wanted to do with my life, got a phone call from Tori Scarborough, who's the same person that was overseeing the Yes We Can program, and just checking in. And I said, if I can help in any way, please let me know. And then she said, well, okay, good to know. A week later, calls me back, says, send me your resume. I was like, well, I'm at work right now, probably shouldn't send me your resume. Then she said, maybe you didn't hear me the first time. You should send me your resume. Now, at that point, I thought about my safety. So I was like, I'm gonna send you my resume. An hour later, I got a phone call from Emily Parcell, who, as Mitch knows, was our political director in Iowa. A week later, I did a 45-minute interview on the phone with Emily. 3 days later, I flew out and met Mitch, Paul Tooze, and the whole crew. And then 9 days later, on March 3rd, 2007, I was in Iowa. My 4th 07 was my first day on the campaign. March 8th, 07, we were in Muscatine, Burlington, the whole southeast Iowa corridor. I am the visualization that black people actually do go to Iowa. You know, that does actually happen. You know? And so, yeah, it does happen. You know, and so that whole journey for the caucus, I was the deputy political director, and I oversaw all the constituency outreach. So, and I can say this with Mitch here. You know, Mitch and Paul Tooze had 2 lines that really resonated with all of us. Mitch would tell us all the time that at the end of the day, it's about growing a list. You know, that's what this exercise is. And Paul Tooze would say to us all the time, to organize himself out of a job. We built it, and that's what we kept thinking about. How do you keep building and build this movement? Campaign ended, and at the end of the campaign, Valerie Jarrett, who's essentially like a second mom to me, reached out, and I just said, I want to work for you. I don't know what that means, but I want to work for you. And they allowed me to do labor outreach for the inauguration. On inauguration day, I was on the bus with the King family, and just kind of crying like a baby, you know, because I'm thinking like, what's going through their minds? I'm going through this experience. 2 days after the inauguration, Valerie calls me back and says, welcome to the White House. And I got to oversee all the African American outreach and minority business outreach at the White House. So I don't take any of that for granted. And did the second campaign with Mitch. We were essentially 10 feet away from each other. And you know, it's a family. I mean, we're very protective of each other. Because a lot of people didn't believe in us. A lot of people laughed at us when we were in Iowa. They didn't think that this was real. And people just wanted to organize. That was it. You know, he just wanted to fight for folks. And so being here tonight, to being home, I think that the main message is, you know, when you really believe in something, don't let anything stand in your way. And if you really, truly want to organize, you really want to be a part of the movement, that's what politics is about, that's what policy is about, and that's why we're here all tonight.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Mike. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And we're on Caesar's time tonight as well. So, Zakiyah, why don't you tell us your story?
Wow, you thought you had to tuck that. So I also believe in the power of stories, and not quite sure how my journey got me to even be at this table, to be quite honest. I got involved in, just like many parents, as part of my children's parents-teachers association when a few of them were in middle school. Let me just preface by saying I have 8. And at this time, some of them were in elementary school. And I became, with no want to do this, was a teacher that said, I think you should run for Parent-Teachers Association. And I said, me? Someone who was involved in my children's education and went on trips when I could, but I don't even know if I ever really attended Parent-Teachers Association meetings, right? So I said, you know, well, I'll try it. And unfortunately, it was a lot of what you hear sometimes with PTAs, which was very cliquish, and I took that on as a challenge. And so when I was on the board, I had people who were there before me that said, you know what, you'll never get any parents to come out. I don't know why you're excited about this. And I thought, okay, that's my challenge, right? And I thought, what would it take to get somebody through the door? What would it take for me to be welcome? It was a smile, it was good morning. And that's what I did. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't have any book that showed me what to do, but I just thought within myself, what would invite me, engage me in coming into the school? And so that experience was that it took us from having, you know, maybe 10 parents to 170 parents at a PTA meeting, or 5 learning leaders, which are volunteers in schools, to 30 learning leaders. And the school dynamic changed totally, where you could come into the school on any given day and find parents helping teachers make copies, or taking young students to the bathroom, or just standing around and just having conversation and welcoming other parents into the room. Let me also say that this is from someone who was extremely introverted and very shy, and wasn't a person who wanted to have any attention put on them. Fast forward a few times as being the PTA and being part of in Brooklyn, in New York City, the UFT has these parent outreach programs in every borough. And so I was attending the Brooklyn Parent Outreach. And at this space was a space where other parents from all across Brooklyn were. It was parents, and sometimes you had guidance counselors there. And it was there that I began to hear stories that, while I thought everything was rosy in my little box that I was in when my children were in elementary school and the other ones were in middle school, it was the stories that I was hearing from parents that literally were like, a 15-minute bus ride away, that, we still don't have books, or our computers aren't working, or we don't have science labs. And it was just like, how could this be? These are children that we fund, and I was not educated on funding and how that looks and budget cuts or any of that. At this moment in time, I think it was the moment for me. It was part of my journey. I was in that place for a reason. NYU had a community involvement program, and they were beginning to formulate a collaborative. They had already had one in the Bronx called CC9. It was parent-led, and they were looking to create one in Brooklyn. And I don't know how, but I somehow volunteered to participate and wound up being one of the founding parent leaders of that, where we actually fought to get science equipment into middle schools. Because what we were realizing was that there was an 8th grade component on science tests, but many of the kids didn't have science equipment. So they were coming there unprepared. So how do you pass the test? Whether you approve of testing or not, how do you pass that when you have no experience with using equipment or even having the equipment? So it was this process that took me to being participating in trainings, that put me in front of Department of Education heads, that put me in front of the chancellor or deputy mayor, to talk about things where that was never in my vision, my sight. But what drove me to that space and knowing I could be in that space was that there were children. It was the stories that those parents were telling me and what I knew my children had, and it was saying that this is not fair, this is not equity. What can I do to step up to make a difference? And this was my little bit to pay, to put forth and help and ensure that those parents and those students were getting things that they were expected to have and needed to have. Fast forward, trainings are happening, I'm getting more knowledgeable about certain things that are going on. We realized that we needed to build citywide power, local power, which just was, just in being in Brooklyn, so we brought those collaboratives together. Parent-led, right? But predominantly Black and Latino parents, some monolingual Spanish speakers, can't come in together to fight for equity and policy changes. And so that was a really powerful piece. And part of some of those successes from doing that, again, knowing that we were just the average parent, that I was not rich, it was just a pure passion of knowing that this was wrong, and it was coming together, and what we drew off of each other of knowing that we could do this together and collectively. No matter what stereotypes said or what others were saying we could not do, right? It was about our children, was our vision. And so it was all those trainings that got me to a moment and a place with creating this citywide parent collaborative that we, after dealing with under the last administration, I feel like, I tend to not say the word. I don't know if any people read Harry Potter, and you're not supposed to say the word Voldemort. So I have kind of not said the previous mayor's name, but I think it's a little silly. So the former Mayor Bloomberg, whether you like him or not, that's just my personal take after 12 years of seeing what was happening in schools, predominantly children of color, 160 plus schools closed, and this divisiveness that was created between parents predominantly of color. We knew that when this election period came up, that this was our moment to move and to make and to shift things. But it was all those years of the trainings and being put in positions of talking to others who normally people would consider powerful, but I saw them as someone who could make a difference. And to me, they were just that. It didn't start off that way, but to me, they were just that. And you have the power to make a difference, so then it's you that I need to address. And so it was that gave me the strength to be able to speak up, to be able to be on panels like this, to be able to be participating in a co-initiator in a national collaborative, an alliance of parents just like me across the country. Again, we don't sit idly by. Stereotypes will tell you that, and we see it all the time on TV. Black parents don't care, they don't come out, they're lazy, they don't know what their children need. If they just did this, their children would be that, right? And that's all we saw. We defy that. We defy that. Here in New York City, and I've seen parents across the country defy that stereotype. And so what I do and what fuels me is that, because this is not a job for me, even though I do get paid, right? But I didn't start doing this, getting paid for a job until about 4 years ago. I would do this and did do this without a paycheck because it is literally the survival of my children and my children's children, and I also have 3 grandchildren now. And so it is literally the survival of my community. And so that's what fuels me to continue this fight, to knock down stereotypes, but also to be able to be on a panel like this and just articulate my journey. Because I think what it does is, when you see my face and you know my name, you can point to someone who you know who has done it.
And it speaks extremely well of both your performance in all of these settings and of our new mayor that you were recently named to his transition team with responsibility for advising him on education policy. So congratulations on that. Susan.
So I wanted to ask an indulgence because I realized I got caught up in the organizing idea, but I didn't tell my story, and I'd like to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes telling you about the day I fell in love with the idea of America. When I was 12 years old, I grew up on a farm, and the community that I grew up in was made up of people who had fled Europe after the concentration camps. Many of the people in the community I grew up in had numbers on their arms, and they were all chicken farmers. They were settled on the chicken farms by a relief organization because eggs were going to be the most in-demand agricultural commodity after the war. But by the middle of the 60s, the prices fell out of the bottom of the market. And these farmers, most of whom were not English speakers, got together and they rented a bus. And my father took me with them. And the first time that I saw Washington, D.C., and the first time that I saw Congress was on a bus full of native Yiddish speakers, non-English speakers, people who had very little, who came with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs to America. And as we rolled up to Congress, several of them turned to me, because I was the only child on the bus, and said, "This is what is amazing about America. In Europe, they tried to kill us, and here we can go and we can talk to our congressman and we can say, help us. And that's what makes America different." And that's the day I fell in love with the idea of America, that government is supposed to represent all of us, and we all have a voice.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your stories. So I'd like to talk a little bit about motivation, because at the end of the day, building that list, whether it's something as big as electing a president, something as abstract as redistricting, or something as concrete as having enough parents so that they can help a child go to the bathroom without a teacher having to leave the room. Whatever it is you're building that list for, motivation is the key. So I'd like each one of you to tell a story or to just offer your thoughts on how to motivate. Go ahead, Mitch.
Mike is much better at motivating people than I am. I will do my best. Part of the process in building relationship, that formula I talked a little bit about earlier, is people generally then will offer up or volunteer what brought them to this room, or what brought them to the office, or what brought them to their neighbor's living room. Everybody generally has a reason, either a curiosity or something happened to them or someone that they cared about, where they thought that they could do something to either benefit themselves or usually to benefit someone very close to them. And so part of the art of that storytelling and the getting back and forth is you actually allow people to tell you why they're there, and then you use that as a motivating force for future action. You have to define for people the theory of change. And so it's often long and hard, and that's one thing that the president talked about all the time in 2007 and 8, and I know there's a lot of people who thought that change would happen quicker. And we talked about that to a lot of people when I was national director at Organizing for America after the first election, is that, listen, he said that this is going to be long and hard. But you keep going back to that story that people offer up. I'm here because my parents can't afford their prescriptions, or I'm here because my child can't afford to go to college, or I'm here because I don't have health insurance, or I'm here because my son's unemployed. There's a whole host of reasons I don't believe in the war in Iraq. There's a whole host of reasons generally that why people self-select to be involved. And part of your job as an organizer is to relate to that and then tell them why this action is going to help alleviate the concern or the reason that you came in the first place. I mean, it's sort of an academic explanation. It's probably not nearly as sexy or nice as others, but ultimately that's what you try to do in a campaign. People will offer up why they're there, and then you want to take that reason and turn it into action.
It's no different in the issue organizing. It's finding out what brought the person there. What's the problem that they see? So often people will tell us they're angry about the excessive amount of money that's in our political system. When we were doing forums about redistricting, it was because communities were angry that they were split in one case between 7 different assembly districts, and therefore they were unable to amass enough political power to move 7 different assembly members to care about the issue that their community, which had been politically fragmented, felt was important to be addressed in Albany. Invariably, people have something that they care about, and the trick in breaking down, in bringing people into the issue, is finding a way to personalize it. How to explain the abstract idea in a way that shows how it hits the individual that you're talking to. And when you find that, then the person becomes an advocate for the cause. But they're there because something moves them to want to see something better. People don't show up for good government events unless they have a certain degree of idealism, unless they have some concept in their mind, and I'm back to my story of what the democracy is supposed to be about. And it's tapping in to their ideal of what the government is about. And I would say 98% of the time, it's the idea that it's government of, by, and for the people. Adequate, fair representation in some way. When you find out which part of that equation is important to them, then you give them the tools to go out and be persuasive to their friends and neighbors and help educate and mobilize on the issue.
Thank you, Susan.
I mean, I would say very similarly the same things, except that what I find is that with parents, sometimes, for me, it's like for me to share my story and people to be able to relate to that, and then to show that there has been success, or that parents like you have moved things and changed things. And so that's something that I believe in has worked for us in having parents lead events. And so you're talking to a parent that can relate to you, that you're showing them that there has been success, because often in our communities there is no hope, or they feel hopeless, and they want to see something. We've heard this before, we've seen this before, right? Show us something that shows that you show and prove, so to speak. And I think it's also about being honest and building relationships. Don't give them something that you know is not doable, or don't put something in front of them that's pie in the sky. Like, be honest. And because in our communities, once again, it's been a lack of trust. We've seen so many people come and go and say, we're going to give you this and we promise you that, and they leave, and guess what? We're left with nothing. And so I think motivating folks is about relating to them, meeting them where they're at, not pushing them beyond where they're at that moment, but showing them, and also showing them where the successes have been, so they can have something tangible to talk about. I saw what they've done, or I got that paper, or I've seen that video of what you're talking about.
And getting the small victories that you can show people some efficacy. Mike?
So I'll come at this 2 different ways. My favorite book, and the book that has impacted me the most, is God's Politics by Jim Wallace. And the last line of it is, we are the ones we've been waiting for. And for me, and this is touching on Zakiyah's point, like, first thing in politics, you just gotta be real with folks. Like, they're expecting fake. they're expecting to be disappointed. Or you just real and just hit someone at their core, you know, that's how you can start to motivate people. Like, I would tell folks, I've seen all sides of it. My oldest brother is a sergeant first class who's been in the Army for 29 years, and I also have two older brothers who've been locked up for crimes they didn't commit. So like, you know, when you're real with folks, like both of my parents dealt with cancer, right? Like when you can just meet someone where they're at, that's how you can motivate somebody. You know, I'm motivating someone for their phone to be ringing right now. You know, so like, you know, when you think about how to touch somebody at their core, that's how you do that. Like if you really want to figure out how to mobilize in that way. Now the second way I'll come at this is, you know, Mitch decided to give me the very difficult job of trying to get, you know, constituencies together that never had voted before in Iowa caucus, you know, and I will always love you nonetheless, you know. And when you do that and you combine that with, you know, like I mentioned, like direct African American outreach, which, you know, there's many blessings also, you know, challenges. You know, Black community has been so disappointed so many times, and you see here's the opportunity with the president, what could happen, and the expectation and excitement, and also building minority coalitions. There's a story about Jacob, Philadelphia. So when you leave the White House, you get a departure photo. Carlton, Philadelphia was part of the National Security Council. And when he was about to leave, him and his wife, they were there with the president, and he has two sons. And he said to the president, you know, each of my sons had a question, but they didn't know what the question was going to be. So the first son gets up and says, you know, Mr. President, why did you eliminate the F-22 fighter jet program? Which, like, completely messed us all up, right? Like, you know, why is this, like, little kid asking about an F-22 fighter jet? Right? Like, you know, like, what do you even do with that? You know, and the president was like, well, because it costs too much, right? So then the second son, Jacob, who at the time was only 5 years old, you know, his question is what really hit home in a lot of ways. So he started to say, you know, Mr. President, I just got a new suit. Mr. President, I just got a haircut. But, Mr. President, I was wondering, if I could touch your hair and know if it feels like mine. And he said it so softly that the president didn't hear him the first time. He asked him to repeat it. He said, I just want to know if your hair feels like mine. And if you go online, you can see the photo. And a lot of folks don't know, like, that's what was happening. Like, this 5-year-old kid was, like, processing in his mind, like, they tell me I can't make it. They tell me I'm not smart enough. They tell me I can't do these things. But, like, I see you, and, like, you're the president. So, like, something's got to work right here, you know? And so, for me, in terms of how to motivate folks, you know, obviously there's power in that because of, you know, color of the skin, but quite frankly, anyone can understand that. Like, everyone has a Jacob in their life. Like, everyone has a kid on, like, this is why I got to do this work. This is why I got to fight for this. And so when we connect policy and politics with the person, that's when motivation really happens.
Thanks so much, Mike. I think everyone on the stage started out as an idealist. And I think everyone on the stage has probably had moments where they question some of their idealism. I'd like to have you maybe relate one of those moments. And then, in particular, and why don't you start, Zakiyah? I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the universal pre-K fight right now and where we are sort of in this political gamesmanship between the mayor and the governor, and reflect on that in the context of idealism and compromise.
Okay. Depending on representing. Okay, so let me just say, it's been a rough week for me, because as I said, for me this is not work, this is just blood, sweat, tears, this is what I do. And so the different debates around people has totally shifted, and so sometimes those who do this need motivation all the time too, and inspiration, because I've been feeling a sense of hopelessness a little bit. It doesn't last long, but it does come, and it's very troubling and disturbing. But UPK, you know, and what's happening with the governor and the mayor is something that doesn't need to happen, right? We have a governor who, for the last 5 years, rather we've had funding or not to education has not been enough, and I've been at the forefront in our organization, AQE has been at the forefront of saying, if we don't have adequate funding, we will constantly see cuts, right? We have a mayor who is progressive and a governor who wants to be progressive or thinks he's progressive. A mayor who ran, and as of January last year, no one thought he was necessarily going to be in the running for mayor, on this agenda of equity and fairness, with UPK and after school at the forefront. And in November 2013, overwhelmingly, by every constituency, folks agreed with that plan as well as other things that he said he was going to do. And said, you know what, UPK is the way we want to go, and 50% of point spread, he won, right? Fast forward now, why are we fighting about this? There's no need to be fighting about this unless there is the politics, which I still don't get, in education. And that, to this day, just, I don't even know where that happens and how that happened, and don't really want to understand it, even though I probably should. Whereas, it is so critical for us to ensure that we have a mayor, and it's not even about him, it's the plan, it's the policy that we know works, that we know after school will keep the most struggling kids engaged and off the streets in a safe space where they can learn. That we know when you have quality universal pre-K that is not, again, we use code words, a babysitting space, right? It is actually a space where children are learning. My children had access to UPK, it was 2.5 hours. If you're a person who has to work an 8-hour job or longer, or more than one job, 2.5 hours doesn't get it, and it doesn't cut it, right? And so universal pre-K and early childhood education, there's tons of research over and over again, despite what folks may say, that show that if we do this right in the front, at the tail end, we don't have to do this. So the fact that we have a battle that shouldn't even be a battle, it's about the politics. And if we put the politics aside, and we're ensuring that it really is about the children, which is what I say about when you organize, you have parents engaged, there's no preconceptions, we get it. We know who our focus is, it often starts with our child, but once you branch out and you start understanding it is about the children. And so that's why the power of organizing and pushing out, and that's why people were up there yesterday in Albany fighting for universal pre-K and after school for middle schoolers, right? And that's why we will continue to fight for that. But it's about the politics right now, and it shouldn't be, it needs to be about the children. So the organizing piece doesn't stop. We will continue to fight for that. There's over 60% of the constituents who make $100,000 or more voted for Mayor de Blasio. So clearly, they're okay with that. And normally, we as constituents and voters, we never have to say anything. We overwhelmingly agree that New York City should have home rule, be allowed to tax those, maybe it's $900 plus a year, right, that they would be paying, to ensure that almost 200,000 children have access to high-quality after-school programs in UPK. It's a no-brainer, right? It's a no-brainer. Did I answer your question?
I'm kind of a tough moderator.
It's okay.
You sort of answered it.
Well, make me answer it.
Okay. So give us your thoughts on where the mayor should go now, given the governor's, apparent concern, whether it stems from his impending re-election bid or not, about raising taxes. He's sort of drawn a line in the sand saying he's not going to do it. How would you proceed at this point as an advisor to the mayor?
I mean, my sense is that we don't stop. The writing is not on the wall yet. It has not been decided. You don't give up. That's not what you do if that's your mission and goal. And I know that's something he really believes in, which is UPK and after school, and so do New Yorkers. So I think you just continue on that path. Again, I think the organizing piece is very important. And it's important for us as community members and clergy, and if you believe in it, to step up and stand up and call the governor out. Because I think that's one of the pieces that's an issue. The governor is not used to being called out, at least by, again, elected officials. And so if they're not going to do it, it is an election year for them. It is time, the people need to continue to step up and push back and say, you know what, if you're not going to push and ensure that we do get home rule, if you're not going to push to ensure that we are getting adequate funding in this state for all children to learn, then guess what? It's an election year. And just like we voted Mayor de Blasio in, you could find yourself out.
Thanks. That was more what I was looking for.
Okay. I deliver.
Mike, what are your thoughts?
Two things come to mind in terms of battling that, idealism and those kind of tough moments. It never went through my mind that we would ever lose either race. I mean, we just knew the numbers, and we just knew we had a plan. Just execute your plan. It wasn't going to be easy, but we felt good the entire time. But twice on the re-elect, they were really tough moments. I was in Denver the night of the first debate, where Democrats were losing their heads. They were like, "Oh my God, what is going on? What is going on?" And I'm the one sitting around trying to be like, "It's going to be okay, everybody. It's going to be okay." Folks throwing their shoes off. It was a rough night.
I watched it with 30 of my new school students, and I mean, these are the people who are going to have to knock on the doors. And 30 students walked out of that room, and there wasn't any door knocking the next day.
Yeah, there was some early drinking going on. But it was one of those, you just gotta stay the course, right? You can't run for anything of that level and expect that every single thing is gonna work. You just can't, of that magnitude. And one thing that Pluck taught us all the time, and Messina also drilled this home, and Mitch and everyone around, is you have to have multiple paths to victory, right? And so we were always confident because I think at the end it got to 42 different paths that we had to win. So we weren't thinking of, okay, with just one night, we were we're gonna win. All this noise, the battleground states are there, we know the numbers, we know the path that's there. But it doesn't make it easier when you're going through those tough moments. But then the second entity was, so I am a lay minister, so I'm in United Methodist and AME, and the toughest moment that I had to battle with is leading a conference call with clergy around the country when the president made his announcement on gay marriage, right? And now let me be very clear, I am supportive of it, right? I've never understood how we get selective with our discrimination. I don't get that, ever, right? You should never allow anyone to be discriminated against, period. And so what I would tell these clergy is I don't understand how you could speak on Sunday morning about we're all God's children, and all of a sudden now you don't want to be standing up for God's children, which was very tense and difficult, and just deep engagements that happened with among communities of color. But I said, look, I need for you to really ask yourself this. On the other side, you have someone in Mitt Romney who is telling you directly, I want you to take your health care away. I want to make it harder for you to vote. I don't even think women should get paid the same that a man should get paid. But you really are going to tell me that this individual is going to be better for your community than Barack Obama? We out here talking about standing up for folks to get rights, and this guy's saying, I want to take rights away from you. And so, when you have those moments, you really got to kind of have those considerations within yourself. And so, idealism is always going to be tested along these journeys. But when you have a plan, idealism can be sustained during it.
Thanks, Mike. Susan, let me ask you about, you were involved in the redistricting battles in California. And that was, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was a scenario where good government folks were trying to take the politics out of redistricting. But there was some evidence later on that suggested that Democrats actually engaged in a little bit of chicanery to get registered Democrats onto a commission that was purportedly independent?
So I actually had left California by then, but I know all of the details because I watched it in great detail.
And it seems to me that this is a little bit of a place where we need to kind of grapple with, idealism colliding with pragmatism. What are your thoughts?
So, first I'd like to correct the record. That Los Angeles Times article was unbelievably naive because everything that I've heard from people involved in redistricting and from people who are on the commission was, of course we knew who was trying to maneuver one way or the other. The knock against the California Independent Redistricting Commission selection process was that it was way too complicated. it had a lottery element to it. So to say that somehow or other the Democrats were better finaglers than the Republicans and they managed to get people in is, I think, really a misunderstanding of the process.
Okay, let me retract that question and go in a different direction then and talk about money and politics.
Okay, so I actually was going to talk about the collision between the two issues that I have spent the most recent decades on, and that is a fair and independent federal judiciary and trying to control money in politics. And in California, where I organized a grassroots group focusing on an independent judiciary, I spent 7, 8 years literally hand building an email list. I didn't have any money. And I didn't have a sexy issue that had thousands of people on it, and built a coalition with 50 organizations, and ultimately we managed to stop several of George Bush's most radical nominees to the federal courts. But it was all practice. It was practice for the really big game, which was the selection and the confirmation of Supreme Court nominees. And we spent a lot of time getting grassroots mobilized on this issue. We put the largest number of phone calls on any individual day into Senator Feinstein's office on a circuit court nominee, but it was all practice. It was building capacity for when we were facing what we knew were coming, which were radical right nominees to the Supreme Court. And the hardest time for me was to see all of the organizing that we put in, to see the grassroots really respond, to see the outpouring of messaging to Senator Feinstein, and to have her say in explaining her vote in favor of Roberts was, well, he told me that he respected precedent. And everything that we provided to her in an analysis of his professional life, the way in which he really came out of the Federalist Society, how really strongly committed he was to very radical right interpretation of the Constitution. Thousands of people, grass tops calling her, articles in newspapers, fact analysis, it didn't matter. It came down to she had a personal conversation with him and she believed him and she sold us all out. So imagine how I felt years later when the Citizens United decision came down. I felt it was a personal failure. We hadn't stopped Roberts on the court, and now the other issue that I had spent so much passion on, controlling money in politics, where we had actually built successful public financing systems, not just in New York, but in Arizona and Maine, and protected them and strengthened them, and we just passed public financing of elections in Connecticut, and the whole thing was kicked to pieces by Citizens United, and it was a reset button, and we had to completely reconceive how we were attacking the problem of money in politics, and we now had to rejigger what we were doing immediately to save the public funding systems that existed, and now also to add a lengthy layer of we've got to amend the Constitution so no Supreme Court can do this to us again. And it was a very bad day. But the thing, I guess, that keeps me going, my Facebook page says that what keeps me going is a combination in equal parts of outrage and idealism. And the idea that I would just give up and that I would accept the fact that they were going to disassemble everything, that money in politics would be completely out of control, and that we would be powerless in the face of that onslaught is just something I guess I cannot put up with. And so I got up the next morning and we started planning. How do we deal with the immediate problem, what's left under this terrible decision, where we can improve the system as much as we can today, and then how do we build a movement which ultimately will help control the very negative impact of large amounts of money in our system. I believe we can do it, and I believe we don't have any alternative. And I guess that's how I keep going. I don't want to look in the mirror and say, I gave up.
Thanks, Susan. Mitch, would you care to reflect on
I have two short examples, I think. The first is 2004. when Tom Daschle lost, I was devastated not only because I really liked Tom. He was the most powerful South Dakotan. This is a very short list. Most powerful South Dakotan, certainly will be in my lifetime. And
Tom Brokaw's pretty hot.
yeah, that's true. That's true. I tweet at Tom Brokaw constantly. He never replies. I fell in love with all the organizers that worked on that campaign, and we had a big crew, and we lost by such a small number of votes that everybody could probably look in the mirror and say, "Did I do everything I could?" I feel good about the effort I put forward, but ultimately it wasn't enough, and it's an incredible burden of guilt that I still have every day, even after everything I've accomplished since then. So that's sort of a downer. I'll tell a story a little bit reinforcing what Mike said about being a family. And so during the primary, we came out this incredible high in Iowa where things had never looked brighter. And I remember I was in Nevada on a freeway when New Hampshire was called. And all of a sudden I said, oops, well, we got to do some work in Nevada, which was the third state. And my counterpart, or the folks who were running the Clinton operation in Nevada, were Robbie Mook and Marlon Marshall, who Marlon's a dear friend of ours. But at that point, I had no idea who either of these guys were. And we lost in Nevada. We then flew immediately back to Minnesota, where Mike and I reunited. And if you can imagine a worse, well, I don't want to say worse place because I love Minnesota, but Minnesota in February is not a... It is the worst. It is cold. And so Mike and I spent, probably 2 weeks there. We had a pretty good Feb 5. We then went down to Texas, and we started in Texas. We were up, but we were there for about 3 weeks, and every single day our vote got a little less, a little less, a little less, a little less, and of course we ended up losing Texas. And Texas was really tough, really, really tough. But right after they said, go to Indiana. I think Mike went to Pennsylvania, right?
That's right.
Yep. And so then in Indiana, that was like a 6 or 7 week campaign. And that was right after the Reverend Wright, the second interview came out. And we went from being 10 up in Indiana to 10 down, literally like in 5 days. Every day you looked at the poll and you saw it. You're like, oh my goodness. And so we finally hit the floor. But it was a 6 or 7 week campaign, and Mike had joined me again from Pennsylvania, where we had lost by 10 points. And so it's not like he came in, brimming with enthusiasm. At this point, everybody's grinding. You just like, I'm going to put one foot in front of another, one foot in front of another. And Indiana is a beautiful place. My wife is from Indianapolis, so I like Indiana. But it's also a very, it can be a challenging state. And as we got closer to Election Day, 3 of our offices were vandalized with very racist rhetoric. Windows were smashed in southern Indiana, Vincent, I remember specifically. And then on Election Day, someone called in a bomb threat. And I laugh now. But, I'm like, okay, I'm at the end of my rope here. I haven't had a vacation or a day off forever, and now I have a bomb threat. And so you call Secret Service and say, we have a bomb threat. And they said it's in 3 offices. They won't tell us which ones, but there's a bomb threat. And the Secret Service guy goes, well, you should see, are there any strange boxes? This is Election Day. I said, what? Are there any strange boxes in the office? I go, yeah, every single one. There's strange boxes everywhere. Like, the whole thing is a strange box. So we had to call an emergency, meeting on Election Day, and I told everybody, I said, just call your police department, ask if they have a bomb-sniffing dog. We had like 35 offices in Indiana, so probably 5 police departments had a dog, but the other 29 did not. And I said, take all your call list and go outside and make calls, like just leave the office. And so they had to go through and clear every one. But during this time, Robbie, who was at this point now the state director, and Marlon for Clinton, Indiana, reached out to me and said, hey man, I hear what's happening. I feel horrible for you. If you guys need an office to work on it, you can use ours. Can you imagine that? Wow. What a great story, right? And I was just like, at that point, like, that's a real, what a nice thing to say. I was like, well, thank you very much. That's completely disarmed. I said, but no, we won't be doing that. We'll just make that. And then, as polls closed...
That was before she had taken a position on the NSA stuff.
Easy.
The first, so then the first county to come in was or the first city was Terre Haute, which is where I've been biased from. And we were down 18 points. And so I asked one of the volunteers, who was a good guy, I'm like, hey, can you go give me some Miller Lite? And so he brought in a six-pack, and I'm watching returns. I'm like, well, I'm going to have a couple beers if this is what's going to happen. And a couple beers led to 6. And if you remember Indiana, we started off way, way, way behind. And then slowly and surely we started inching back, and all of a sudden they said it's too close to call, or it's too early to call, and it's too close to call, and all of a sudden they went to toss up. And our communications director goes, hey Mitch, can you get on TV? And I'm looking at my I go, no idea. And so, you know, I was lucky enough to, when I had my darkest moment, which was about 10:30 that morning, I also had a great moment about 12 hours later, I think it's about 18 hours later, where Tim Russer said, and I'll never forget this, he said, we now know who will be the Democratic nominee for president. And so, you know, went from the lowest of the low that morning to the highest of the highs later that evening. And so I was pretty lucky in that regard. But if I had to narrow down 2004, I took a year off of politics after that.
Great story. Thanks very much. I'd like to take a few questions from the audience. And Nicole is going to be around on that side, and Jackie's going to be around on that side with the microphone. So, all right. Why don't we go to this young lady?
Thank you. This has been a really interesting evening, and seeing sort of the array of experiences has been really cool. And as somebody who, when I was watching the initial sort of build-up to the Obama campaign, I was like, oh, this is interesting, where's it gonna go? And I guess I would ask maybe all of you, given that huge groundswell of grassroots organizing and sort of a huge nationwide proof that this actually can work, so what happens next? Because I think for a lot of people who got really motivated, we're like, oh wait, who is this guy? What is he doing to public education? What is he doing in foreign policy? And so where does this stuff go next? I guess is the question that I would have for you guys. Like, maybe it's a very personal, not a professional question, but where would you like to see some of the things that you worked on go next, or beyond electioneering, or those kinds of questions?
Zakiyah, since you're helping take it, you know, to the next place with Mayor de Blasio, if you want to do that.
Too kind. You make me seem like I'm running things, but I mean, where I wanted to go, obviously, is the things that the mayor ran on, that they come to fruition. Because as I shared, he talked about fairness and equity, and we haven't had that nationally either, but specifically in New York City in the last 12 years. And then at the same time, that we, you know, focus on the children and stop focusing on the stuff, because the stuff is, you know, it's just steering us in the wrong direction. And as we go and we're trying to do reform to, you know, to decrease the school to prison population and all this other stuff, the fact what we're doing in public education right now is going to be doing just the opposite, right? It's going to be fueling our prisons as opposed to lessening the folks in those prisons. And our children deserve better. They didn't ask to be brought here, but they definitely deserve to be treated better than they are. And what I want statewide as well is that we are actually funding schools at an adequate amount of money, an equitable amount of money, excuse me, and that we are prioritizing those communities who need it the most first. But what we're getting is just the opposite. And so if we can focus on really on, you know, prioritizing, which is really important, and sometimes we get into the race conversation, but that's okay, because we need to have that conversation, because there's folks that believe we live in a colorblind, post-racial society. No, we don't. I'm just telling you, we don't. As someone with 7 girls and 1 black boy, we don't live in that space. So what I want and hope this takes us to is an equitable situation, not only locally, but on a national level as well.
Thanks very much. Jackie?
My question is related to media and messaging. you know, Mr. Stewart, you brought up the point about how you guys have done so much work and got the polls up, and then the Run Right story came out. And I feel like this happens continually in organizing, is we'll put all the work in, and then some stupid little tidbit gets spun out of control by the right-wing media machine. How do you continue like working forward and cutting through that when the airwaves and is being completely taken over by one little.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's going to be a constant challenge for us specifically, because there is money in politics, and for the most part, we're always going to be on the losing end of that. And so, one of the things that we would tell our volunteers is that you have to, now that you have this skill set where you can go out and you can tell your story, and you can talk about why you're involved and why you're supporting, you know, in our case, President Obama, you now have this responsibility to carry that out. And the president needs you to push back against that one large megaphone with thousands and tens of thousands. And on the campaign, we ended up having about 2.2 million volunteers speaking up for him. And so we try to turn that into a rallying cry. The reality is it's very difficult. There's two different ways that you can get sidetracked. One is an unintentional event that you had nothing to do, that, you know, just sort of happened. Or the second can be a planned attack. So the other example I have is during the primary in Texas. Folks may remember the TV ad, the 3 a.m. phone call. It was devastating. And it was, you know, brilliant strategy on their part. I mean, it really, really hurt. And because of that, you know, we went from being basically even or maybe even a little ahead to down. And so I always try to turn that into a motivating force for the organization. You should be the voice that pushes back against this. And you can also do some strategic things. So after that, the thing that people love to do in Indiana is play basketball. Everywhere. You literally, I mean, Hoosiers is a real life story. You drive up and down roads, you see basketball hoops everywhere. And so the president loves to play basketball, so we did a 3-on-3 tournament. We had Calvert Cheney, who was a big Hoosier alum, do some press for us. Reggie Love, who traveled with the president, played at Duke. I mean, he played basketball all the time in Indiana. He loved Indiana because he played basketball.
He played on every election day morning. Wasn't that a tradition? Kind of a good luck thing for him?
Yeah, it was. So, good stuff.
Thank you. Richard Jordan, President of Concerned Citizens Speak, a Gramercy Park-based citizens organization. Mitch, a very specific question. How do you deal with the unexpected, such as last Democratic primary for mayor, people come to vote at 6:05 a.m. The voting machines have not been delivered to their district. We show up, you can't vote. You have the best strategy in the world, 0 votes. What do you do?
So, we actually would plan for that too. And so we had a Protect the Vote program that Mike and I helped spearhead, where we would identify and have both lawyers, but you didn't have to be a lawyer to be an advocate for voting rights. You just had to be someone who could make decisions on election day. And so what we try to do then is we have people there, you know, 5:15 or 5:45 or 15 minutes before polls open, and then they had check-in periods. So it would be 6, 10, 2, and 6. Basically 4, where they would say, okay, polls open or polls are not open, and then that person would tell everybody in line, hey, just hang on in line, you know, we made a call, someone's coming down, they're unlocking the doors. And so, you know, I hate to try about this, but, you know, you really do try to plan for the unplanned. And a good example of that is on election day, you probably read press stories about Orca. Which was the Romney turnout machine on election day, where people would call in to this, you know, master database, and I think they rented out the Boston Square, whatever, the Boston Garden, did they? So the whole Boston Garden was full of phone banks ready for people to take in numbers so that headquarters could make decisions. And what happened is we tried this in 2008, and it didn't work. And so on election day, they had no idea what was happening because they didn't plan for any sort of alternative to this. So we had something very similar, but it was all computer-based. But we also had backup plans just in case that failed. And so the level of planning that goes into running a campaign, both at the state level, but certainly at the presidential level, is baffling. One of the mentors that we had on the campaign was Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google. And you know, we'd ask him, like, so after the fact, like, what was the most surprising thing about the campaign? He's like, well, how young people were. He's like, how hard people worked. really shocked him. But then he also said the level of organization and strategy that goes into decision making. It's just like if you're not involved, you would never know. And so, short answer is just be prepared.
Thanks. And there's another gentleman. Almost got to ask a question. Now we're getting engaged.
Half the panel represents, I guess, let's call them grassroots organizations, and half the panel represents people who work on political campaigns. And I guess one of the primary lessons to me of electing Obama, and I volunteered, is, and it would have been a disaster if either of those Republicans had won. But on the other hand, it ain't so great. It's certainly not enough. Even electing the president is clearly not even close to enough. And so I guess, and we need a hell of a lot more permanent organizing, not just electing officials, but getting much more of the American people involved on a regular basis. And so I guess I'd like to hear some thoughts on how we do a lot more of that, because, they got money, you gotta have people.
But I think one jumping off point, and then I want to let the panel take this, is really, it didn't get a ton of credit in 2008, was Howard Dean, which after he took control of the DNC in early 2005, he said, hey, I don't care if we don't compete in presidential elections in Mississippi or Alabama. We still have to have a 50-state strategy in case there comes a time, or to build for a time when we can't compete. And I think that's one of the reasons that states like Georgia are potentially coming into play in 2016, and maybe one of the reasons that states like Virginia, North Carolina, Colorado came into play on the presidential level earlier than a lot of people thought they might, in addition to favorable demographic trends. So I think that type of permanent organizing that he espoused with the 50-state strategy and putting national party resources in untraditional places is one important step. What are y'all's thoughts, Mike?
I mean, I think the neighborhood team model that we had was beyond just the campaign. It was about continual organizing. We have several of our alum staff and volunteers who are now elected officials around the country because the teams on their own kept organizing, even after the campaign was done. We have to convey to folks that it is much bigger than just electing a president if you want real change to happen. Like, that's just one step of that. I would tell all the time, like, Barack Obama was like the president. He wasn't elected Messiah. He's not your savior. It's like there's more that has to happen from there. There's mutual, best friend of ours, Jeremy Bird and I, we're founding board directors of an entity called IVO. And a lot of it is, pushing back on the secretaries of state or trying to make it harder for people to go vote in some of these states. That's part of the movement. Part of the movement is how you provide more capacity to these CBOs and community-based organizations on the ground that are doing great work, because they're the ones that are going to keep the energy going. So I think the core of this is we all know how to organize. Like, there's a lot of different organizing strategies that have been happening for years, and that's going to continue. How do we start having a continual strategy that is much longer beyond this one election? Like, Georgia is going to turn, Texas is going to turn. Like, these states are happening. The numbers cannot be denied. By 2050, if not earlier, people of color are going to be the majority in this country. And you look at these battleground states, we won 9 of the 10 battleground states because of the movement that was happening itself. But a lot of this was because, women and young people and progressive leaders and black people, Latino, all these different communities decided to get mobilized. But now what we have to do to the question, and someone mentioned this earlier, is how do you now continue to remind people that it is beyond an election? And I think the perfect clear example of that is 2010, where you had so many communities that did not show up to vote, that if they were showing up to vote, we'd have substantial differences that could have happened around the country. But they were only tied to being excited to the president. They weren't excited to the process. They weren't excited to the movement, excited to the cause. And then we had all these cyclical impacts. I do not believe we're going to have a repeat of that this year. Some folks are so terrified about what's going to happen this year. I don't see that happening, because I think folks are understanding, look what happened when you weren't involved in 2010. This could lead to a movement occur in a different way.
Can I also share that I think it's about how do we begin to have conversations with those grassroots leaders and parents and others about running for office, right? Many of us don't think about that. As many times people come up to me and said, you should run. I don't want to, but I do know parents, if they were educated on what that looked like, if they weren't afraid of what, or they have preconceived notions of what that is, there was support, there was someone there, like Michael Cooper shared their story, there was someone there that encouraged them, inspires them to do that, that I think we can begin to have leadership in these spaces who are used to being on the ground, who are connected to the ground, and then when they get in these elected offices, they don't forget about the ground, and the ground supports them and holds them up. And I think those are conversations we need to begin to have too, not only in New York City, but around the country. It's like, how do you raise up parents and young people who are just graduating high school, who are impacted by a lot of these policies that they've been fighting against, to take that leadership and say, you can do this too. You can run for office.
Susan, did you have something? Okay, what I'd like to do to close the night is to give each panelist 30 seconds, because again, I know you're organizers at heart. So I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds to promote one cause that you believe in and explain how everybody out here can get involved, because you couldn't have a better audience here if you want activists. You want to start, Mitch?
No, I don't. Let me go.
What do you mean? You can't
All right.
take advantage of this opportunity.
I'm trying to think of, one issue that we're particularly interested in is, expanding universal background checks on gun purchases. And so I come from a state like South Dakota. It's very red and very rural, and it just doesn't make sense to me that you want to fill out or wait and have a background check before you can buy or purchase a firearm. And so what I would ask is, there are a host of organizations out there, and New York City has been a leader in this, is to make sure that you donate your time or your resources, whatever you can do to help this fight. Right now, it's not a political issue in red states, and we need to make it one. And so it's one issue that I'm very passionate about and happy to work on behalf of.
Thanks, Mitch. Susan?
So I made the beginning of my pitch for fair elections and involvement here in New York State. I talked about Citizens United and how it put us back in our campaign to control the corrosive impact of large amounts of money in politics. The only place in the country where we have a chance of actually adopting a public financing of election system right now is New York. We have been building this movement, we have been working hard, and for the first time, Governor Cuomo has put the fair elections public financing package in the budget. And we need to hold him to that commitment. It's really easy for him to negotiate it out and then turn around and say to us, well, I gave you what you wanted it in the budget. But the truth of the matter is, when I sat down with the other 3 guys or the 4 guys in the room, they really wouldn't go, and the Republicans said they wouldn't do it. We need to show that this is the year we can be a model again in New York for getting things right and beginning this process of controlling corrosive large amounts of money in politics. So we are lobbying in Albany next week. We are phone banking. We are working in the Republican Senate districts with our Republican members, getting letters to the editor. There is tons to do. We think we can keep it in the budget. We think we can pass it. If we don't keep it in the budget, we've got to keep the pressure up. This is the year to get fair elections. So go to commoncause.org/NY, sign up, let's get it done.
Thank you. Mike?
First of all, for any people of faith, happy Ash Wednesday. The only reason I'm not in service is because I was here. So, so respect for those on that faith. I'm running for office this year. So if you want to learn more, follow me on Twitter at MrMikeBlake, and you can find out what that will be. And I'm prepared for Ben to tweet that out pretty immediately. I know that was going to happen.
Scoop?
Just a little bit. In terms of causes, I really would encourage folks to learn more about iVote, which I mentioned earlier, iVoteForAmerica.org, and it's FOR spelled out. This is going to be the beginning of a very exciting movement. We're focusing on 4 states out the gate: Iowa, Ohio, Colorado, Nevada, and then build from there to not allow these Secretary of State that are making it hard for people to vote. We're going to stop that. And so if you want to be a part of that cause, we encourage you to join with us. And thank you for tonight.
Thank you. Zakiyah?
I So if it wasn't clear what I was talking about earlier, I'll just so there's a few things. One, again, is the attention towards the state. Next Wednesday, the 12th, I think it's Wednesday the 12th, we're bringing folks to Albany as well, from New York City, but all across the state. Our commitment is, what we want the state, the governor and the state legislature to do is put $1.9 billion in school aid statewide, to allow New York City to have home rule on their UPK and after school. And what you can do to help support that is either contact us to get on the bus with us, and or every day until that budget is passed, call your state assembly person and senator and the governor and say that I live in New York City should have home rule, let us fund UPK and and after school, and at the same time put enough money in the budget of $1.9 billion, which we could have used if we known into the budget, so we're ensuring that there are no more cuts to schools statewide, as well as the fact that schools need to be able to begin to restore programs to schools. AQE.org. AQENY.org. Oh, that's bad. Alliance for Quality Education.
And mine, very briefly, the fastest growing cohort in prison in this country are the elderly. They constitute almost no risk to society. They've already served considerable time. And the Correctional Association of New York is working to try to change parole board policies, because right now in New York, we release just a small fraction of those elderly inmates. Despite their huge medical expense within the system, we release a very small percentage relative to other states, and despite their minimal threat to society. You can get involved by emailing apinto@correctionalassociation.org. Thanks to the panelists who were fantastic, and thank all of you for coming.